Thank you, Dr. Karani, very much for that lovely introduction. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right in because one of the things I always wonder when someone gets up to give a talk is how many slides am I going to have to sit through? There are 32, so you can do the countdown if you want. 32 slides. So a couple of words of introduction before I jump in because I want to cover a fair amount of ground. One is just acknowledgements. The presentation is my presentation, but almost everything that I'm going to present. Oh, what impeccable timing. Nathan Case. Everything that I'm going to present is work that many of us have done that was built on the foundation of what Nathan Case established 25 plus years ago in the Humanities and Medicine program. So an acknowledgement to Dr. Case for starting the process and for inspiring us, not just with his ideas back then, but on an ongoing basis. Dr. Rip, you want to sit down? You're making me nervous. And then the other acknowledgement is for a lot of people who, over the course of time, have worked on many of the programs that I'm going to discuss. I think because this has a lot to do with recruitment and admissions, chief among them is Valerie Parkas, her amazing team in admissions, George Schreiner, who's relatively new to the process but really helped us to build the FlexMed program, and then others who've joined over the course of time. So I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged all those people. And the only other word of introduction is I picked a title that I thought was a little bit provocative, and I present it as the premise for why we're doing what we're doing, and I'll walk through the process of why I think that's the case. But I wanted to make clear in the beginning that I am not going to make an effort to prove that this is so, that enhancing diversity leads to meaningful innovation that then leads to progress. I firmly believe it in my bones, and I'll try to provide examples of other people who believe the same thing. But I didn't want to leave you with the impression that this was going to be a data-driven attempt to prove this, because no one's been able to prove it to date. Okay. I regret to inform you that I have no conflict of interest. So this is kind of a quick overview of what I'm going to do. I want to talk about the history of medical education and Abraham Flexner. I want to do it because in looking into it more, I learned stuff that I never imagined was possibly true. I took at face value the myth of Abraham Flexner and how pre-medical education, pre-medical preparation evolved over the course of time, and I found it to be riddled with holes. And I think that without understanding that, it's hard to understand where the critique of all of that comes from. I'm going to go through a little bit of data that talks about what's wrong with chemistry, what's wrong with the MCAT, why those things make a difference to us in the larger scheme of what healthcare and biomedical research looks like, and then a couple of examples of what we're doing. Some of the big key messages are things that you're probably somewhat familiar with. There's never been any empiric evidence to support the way in which people are prepared as undergrads for medical school. None of it was ever based on any data anywhere. There are a fair number of people who have made the case over the course of time that the system as it has existed has done more harm than good. And then I think it's important to know that we are one of the few schools in the country that has really developed and implemented viable alternatives. And so we're leading the pack. That's very exciting. The one other point that I think is important to make is that a lot of this is a significant critique of the way many of us in the room were prepared to go to medical school. And so sometimes it can feel a little bit, again, provocative, almost as if it's a statement of how good a doctor I can be or anyone else in the room can be. And that's not at all what this is about. So I wanted to say that up front. It's much more about how much better the system could be or could have been for any one of us who trained in a particular way and ways in which we're trying to improve it over the course of time. There are 2 chairs, but you don't have to sit down if you don't want to. All right, so a couple of words about source material, or maybe not. Where is that? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. All right, there we go. So this book is called Enhancing Diversity in the Medical Profession, a Century After the Flexner Report, Questioning the Medical Paradigm. I put it up there because I read through the book. We invited Donald Barr to come here in June this past year to a summit that I'll mention later. This book is where I got most of the information about the history of how pre-med education evolved, and also a lot of the data, because he was the one who was primary investigator for the impact on things like chemistry courses and undergraduate fallout from the pre-med path. And then even though I cite many of these papers in individual slides, I wanted to just have one slide with references in the event that anyone wants to look at this at a later date. It is certainly available to you. So, Abraham Flexner was a pretty remarkable man. Graduated at the age of 19 from Hopkins as an undergraduate. Taught for several decades, mostly in high schools in the Midwest. Was a pretty established educator, and then at some point in his career, the Carnegie Foundation identifies him as the person they want to do a national review of medical education across the country. It was early in the 20th century. Medical care was considered to be appalling. Medical education was in disarray, and the educational programs were considered to be a big part of the reason that medical care was so bad. And so he goes through this, what I understood to be a superhuman effort, where in the course of 18 months, he travels around the country to more than 160 medical schools, does a full thickness review of all those schools, comes back and writes a report and critiques not only every individual school, but the whole system of medical education. One of the schools he visits is Hopkins. He chooses that as his gold standard. He considers that of all the schools he's seen, it's the most rigorous preparation for medical school and medical education. He uses that as the gold standard, and as a result, most of the medical schools totally shut down over the course of a couple of years after that. So there's a huge impact on medical education, both in the moment, and then everyone else builds their medical curriculum around the norms that he established. So that's what I understood to be the case. The story at, all right, this is going to torture me a little bit. Nice mutton chops, right? So this is a gentleman whose name is Daniel Gilman, Daniel Coit Gilman. I want to give you a little bit of his history because he's the driving force behind why the Hopkins model was what it was. And basically what it was a 2+2 model. A lot of science as a foundation in the beginning of medical school, and then clinical rotations afterwards, and it was like that a long time before. It was sort of the first. So Gilman, in 1872, I'm going to throw around some years. You don't have to remember them. I think the only thing you have to remember is that in 1910, Flexner wrote that report. So in 1872, he's recruited from Yale to travel across country to be the second president of UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. He tries very hard then to convince the board that the new medical school at UCSF should have science requirements. And the board says, no way, it's going to trash our enrollment. We can't possibly put science requirements in place. So over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, he leaves. I don't think he left just because of that, but it was one of the many things he failed to implement at UCSF. In 1875, he's recruited to be the first president at Hopkins of the undergraduate institution, right? And his charge, when he gets there, is to do 3 things, really simple. Build a university, build a hospital, build a medical school. Piece of cake. And so he gets there in 1876. In 1878, he proposes once again that there needs to be a formal pre-med curriculum at Hopkins undergrad. He presents that to the Board of Trustees. He wants the curriculum pre-med to be physics, chemistry, biology, Latin, French, German, English. And he bases it on the European, mostly the German model of medical education, which had been in place then for quite a while, and the Germans were really the leaders in medical education back in the late 19th century. The board refuses. It's the second strike. So a little time goes by. In 1889, he establishes the hospital. In 1893, the School of Medicine. And finally, in 1893, when he establishes the school, he gets to put in place the 2+2 model at Hopkins, right? This is 1893. Flexner was 1910. He gets to put in place the 2+2 model, right? 2 years of science, 2 years of clinical, and pre-med requirements prior to that. So he's a big player. Gilman is a big player. He gets most of the credit for creating the Hopkins model that Flexner uses as the gold standard. And this is where it gets a little hot. So the real story, anybody recognize who these women are? So the real story plays out like this. The woman on the left is Kerri Thomas. I'll just read you a little bit about her background. She's born in Baltimore. She's a Quaker, as was Johns Hopkins. His name was Johns Hopkins, not John Hopkins. Don't ever make that mistake in Baltimore. She is a brilliant woman who is rebuffed from graduate studies at all American universities because she's a woman. She goes to Europe. Most of the schools there refuse to take her on as a graduate student as well. She finally ends up at University of Zurich. She becomes their first PhD graduate who is a woman. Determined. And she also, while in Europe, falls in love with the German model of medical education. She comes back and becomes the first dean at Bryn Mawr, right? And then she has, because of her connections in Baltimore, because she was born there, she has many, many friends, mostly daughters of trustees from Hopkins and Bryn Mawr, who are sort of her social circle, including the woman on the right, Mary Garrett, whose father created the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And he died, so he left the entire railroad to her. She was probably the richest woman in the country at that time. And she, Mary Garrett, and M. Kerri Thomas were, what do we call them today? Domestic partners? What? BFFs? Yeah. Is that what?
That's not what we call it.
And it's interesting because it was a relatively open relationship, but to the extent that it could be back then. So here's the way that things played out. In 1890, and I told you guys that Hopkins established the hospital in 1889, right? Gilman, the hospital in 89 and the School of Medicine in 93. In 1890, after the hospital was established, Garrett, the railroad woman, tells Gilman at Hopkins that she will give him $100,000, which at that time was a hell of a lot of money, towards opening the School of Medicine on one condition: he has to admit women to the school. It would be the first school of medicine in the country to admit women. He says, fine, anything for money, right? He's a dean. He'll do whatever it takes for money. He still needs $400,000 because apparently he needed $500,000 to create the entire School of Medicine. A bargain, I imagine. But he makes no progress in fundraising. He's got her $100,000 and he cannot raise the other $400,000. And then she comes back to him in 1892, 2 years later, and says she will commit the rest of the money from herself and her social circle if he guarantees her the following. The medical school has to be a 4-year medical school. It has to require a bachelor's degree. It has to have pre-med requirements of a year of physics, a year of chemistry, a year of biology, all with labs, French and German, and those have to be the pre-med requirements in perpetuity. She basically lays down the line, and she does it because of her relationship with M. Kerri Thomas and Thomas's conviction that the German model of education was the way to go. So she's got Gilman over a barrel, so to speak. He goes back to the Board of Trustees and he says, I've got the money, but I've got to, and the board says, amen, go ahead, go for it, do it. So in February of 1893, they agree. and then Garrett ultimately gives a substantial gift to Bryn Mawr on the condition they make Thomas the president of Bryn Mawr, which of course they did. And then she left her entire $15 million fortune to her over the course of time. She also put a clause in her deal with Gilman that if Hopkins ever changed the pre-med requirements and the system she put in place, the entire endowment would revert to Bryn Mawr. She was a tough broad. So that's the real Hopkins story, and I want to kind of fold it back to Flexner and maybe using too much time. So these are the 6 schools that guy, the book I showed you in the beginning, Donald Barr, reviewed. They're the first 6 schools, major schools to be established in the United States, and this is just their names and the year they were established. So if you go back to 1873, the first medical school was Michigan to have any requirements in place for pre-med preparation, right? Because that's what we're focused on now. Charles Eliot from Harvard comes along, and he tries to establish some requirements at Harvard. This is earlier in the 19th century. And by 1877, a little bit after University of Michigan, he's able to establish that you have to have a high school diploma. Pretty scary. You have to have exams in Latin and physics, and that's as far as he gets. And by 1893, which is the year that Hopkins was established, the other schools, UCSF, Michigan, and Columbia, all put very similar pre-med requirements in place. Right? So by 1893, there were a cluster of schools, the best in the country, because there were 150 others, that had pre-med requirements. In 1876, the precursor, going back a little, the precursor of the AAMC was called the American Medical College Association. And back in 1876, one of their important charges was to create standardized national requirements for medical school. It was an abysmal failure. It was so bad and caused so much infighting that the entire organization fell apart. And then probably a decade later, it was resurrected as the AAMC. And again, they began to advocate very strongly for national standardized requirements for medical school. They refined them over the course of a decade in 1901, where it became English, math, physics, Latin. And then at some point, the AMA American Medical Association established something that's called the Council on Medical Education, the CME, not CME, but the Council on Medical Education. By 1904, the Council on Medical Education had sort of jumped on the bandwagon. They said, yes, there has to be a pre-med course of study. You have to have a college degree, and medical school should be 2+2. So there was a building sentiment that this needed to be the system that was in place. Certainly by 1904, remember Flexner was 1910. And then what happens is, right after the CME and the AMA and the AAMC, this alphabet soup, comes to this universal conclusion, members of the CME, the Council on Medical Education, do a trip across the country and review all 160 medical schools. It took them 2 years. They came to the conclusion that 50% were acceptable, 30% were doubtful, and that 20% of the schools in the country were totally unacceptable. The kicker is that they were of the profession, and they were very uncomfortable presenting this data in a public forum, right? Because they were afraid of what it would do within the medical profession, critiquing each other. So they hired the Carnegie Foundation, which had a great reputation, was independent, presumably objective, and they wanted the Carnegie Foundation to collaborate with them to create a report that would be better received publicly and look more objective. Flexner's out of work, right? He teaches in high school for about 20 or 25 years. He goes off on a European jaunt with his family. He comes back. He has nothing to do. The Carnegie Foundation gets a letter of reference for him from Hopkins, because he was a graduate from there, and they pluck him out of relative obscurity. Here's a quote from him from the book. As our family resources had been depleted during the preceding 3 years in Europe, I confess, prepared to do almost anything of a scholarly nature. I called his attention, at the Carnegie Foundation, who was interviewing him for the position of reviewing medical schools. I called his attention to the fact that I was not a medical man and never had my foot inside a medical school, and it really didn't make much of a difference. So Flexner's hired by Carnegie. They give him the CME report, the review of 160 schools, right? He goes to visit Hopkins first, decides to use that as a metric by which he would measure all the other schools, and then does his review. So it was pretty preordained the way this was going to play out. So I think it's interesting to know how it was managed. And I think it's interesting to know, again, that other than the basis of the German model, which in that time revolved around the importance of chemistry, because chemistry was so important in terms of discoveries in the mid and late 19th century for the medical profession, there wasn't a lot of data driving this process. It was opinions of people from Bryn Mawr who'd been in Germany and others who'd had those experiences and wanted to bring it back to the United States. So almost from the very beginning, there was critique. I put some of the years in bold. And you can read them. I don't think it pays to read through each one. Some of them are presidents of universities. Some of them are heads of these national organizations that I mentioned. But there was a lot of critique from the very beginning. You're ascertaining not whether a man has a proper preparation for the study of medicine, but whether he has gone through a regime of training. With great trepidation, he enters what the Harvard Crimson calls the rat race. All the stuff that we hear today on a pretty regular basis, they were talking about well early in the 20th century. And the critique, not a good clicker, I guess. Come to Papa. I have to wait for the next slide. But the critique continues. There are a couple more papers cited there. Any suggestions on what I do to move the slide? There we go. Lewis Thomas, many people are familiar with his work, 1978, 2008. We must stop complaining about the problematic choices that pre-med students make and start fixing the system that fosters such choices. So a lot of the critique revolved around different things. There was too much science in the pre-med curriculum. There wasn't too much science, but it was the wrong science that was being taught. It was self-selecting people for the wrong traits, competitiveness, ambition, as opposed to humanism. It was weeding out creative talent. It was creating this pre-med syndrome that was very grades focused and not at all focused on learning. And so building up on that critique, I wanted to review the next part of the presentation, which is a little bit of a discussion based on research of chemistry in particular in pre-med courses, and then a little talk about the MCAT. So these are two papers Donald Barr, who wrote that book, is first author on both of them. And it was a study of the impact on underrepresented minority students in an undergraduate setting. One of the studies was done at Stanford and one at Berkeley, two reasonably good schools. And really what he was interested in was finding out why the dropout rate, not dropout from school, but what was it that was making students at these two schools abandon their pursuit, their sort of lifelong dream of becoming doctors. And it was really stimulated by the fact that he used to be a pediatrician. He went back and got his PhD in sociology, became faculty at Stanford. And even though he wasn't really involved in the medical school, students knew about his reputation. They would come to him for sort of informal counseling. And at some point he realized that most of the students who were coming to him, many of the students who were coming to him were black women. And it really started to get under his skin. He felt like there's a trend here. There must be a reason that this is going on. And so he did quite a rigorous study and figured out that that regardless of things like SAT scores or your academic ability in school, it was consistently chemistry courses, more organic chemistry than basic chemistry, that was pushing people out. Some of them were pushed out because they struggled with the coursework and left, but many others left because they just could not deal with the environment that those courses created in an undergraduate pre-med experience. Sorry. And so this is just a quick quote from one of his papers. Consistent with reports over more than 50 years, and some of those reports are really mostly anecdotal, it appears that undergraduate courses in chemistry have the effect of discouraging otherwise qualified students, as reflected in their admission to one of the most highly selective public universities, this was from Berkeley, from continuing in pre-med studies, especially in the case of URM students. And so he not only saw that chemistry courses pushed students out, it disproportionately pushed out minority students, and it disproportionately pushed out women, regardless of whether they were from a minority group or not. So, some would say, big deal, pre-med is tough, the courses are rigorous, what's wrong with that? And I think, there are a lot of different ways to address that statement. One of them is that doing well in these courses really has nothing to do with your overall intellectual ability. And the other is that if you're going to create some high standards or level of rigor, maybe it should be something that is truly relevant to the lifelong practice of medicine or the lifelong pursuit of biomedical research. And it's not necessarily the case that chemistry or organic chemistry are those deciding factors. So that's a little bit about chemistry. The MCAT. So in May of 2013, and probably some of you saw this in Academic Medicine, there were a series of probably 7 or 8 articles that were all published as a review of the MCAT. I'm not going to present all of them. I just want to present a couple of them that I personally found to be totally fascinating. And to give academic medicine a lot of credit, many of the papers were published by people who created the MCAT, have revised the MCAT recently, and did a lot of data analysis on the impact the MCAT has had over the course of time. But many of the articles were sort of the counterpoint. So this is, I think, one that stood out for me the most. Should the MCAT exam be used for medical school admissions in Canada? The authors are all medical educators who are Canadian, and they asked these 3 questions, and they presented the answers to them almost as a debate, point, counterpoint. Is the MCAT exam equal and useful in Canadian admissions, given their environment and culture and society? Does the MCAT exam affect matriculant diversity, and is the MCAT exam a strong predictor of future performance? And they're Canadians. They took a very balanced approach to this. But at the end of the day, their conclusions were what you would expect. The MCAT impedes the ability of admissions committees in Canada to assess and value non-academic factors. So it completely kills their ability to do sort of a holistic review of applicants. Commercialization of prep courses leads to anxiety, cost, loss of time, and disadvantages to students, in particular those who have less personal and economic resources. They found it to be a huge barrier to Indigenous peoples in Canada. Again, the cost, the very narrow focus on grades, excluding all else. And they found also that based on the data they reviewed, the MCAT predicts future exam performance and to some extent medical school performance, but not clinical skills, not aptitude, not personal attributes, not residency performance, not scientific ability. Sorry. So, I thought it was a fascinating article. I'll run through a couple more elements having to do with the MCAT. So, does anybody not know what USNWR stands for? Everybody knows that. It's like tattooed over here. It's U.S. News and World Report. Come on, Joy, U.S. News and World Report. It's our bread and butter. So There are a lot of people who talk about the tyranny of the MCAT, but a lot of people also who talk about the tyranny of US News and World Report. Because the MCAT inherently is not a bad exam. I mean, it tests knowledge that people think is really important for medical school, and I'll talk a little bit about how the MCAT was recently revised. The way in which the MCAT is used, it's almost like a gun, right? If you choose to use it as a gun to kill people and embed it in the ranking for medical schools, right, and create a system where the degrees of freedom a dean has to adjust almost anything else is pretty close to zero. Your NIH funding is what your NIH funding is. Your reputation score you can't control because it's this ridiculous survey that hundreds of people fill out. At the end of the day, your dean is going to press hard for a higher average MCAT and a higher average GPA. That happens to different extents at different schools across the country, but as a factor that determines the degree to which MCAT is high stakes for pre-med students, it's undeniable. This is probably where the biggest disaster is of all. Okay. Oh, you'll never see that. Can you see any of those numbers? A couple of other articles from that issue of Academics. So this is an overview of the medical school admissions process and use of applicant data in decision making. What's changed since the 1980s? So you can see at the bottom it says this is the percent and number of applicants in 2008, 9, 10 combined who were offered acceptance by one or more medical schools, right? And they're distributed here based on the column on your left is their GPA. Can you see any of the numbers or not really? All right, so the top GPA is on top over there, 3.8 to 4.0, and then 3.6, 3.4, and then across the top is your MCAT score. The top range over there is 9 to 45. I didn't even know there was a 45 in the MCAT. And then on down. And so this was fascinating for me to see just what kind of range of MCAT score and GPA still gets into medical school. This is people who've gotten to at least one medical school in the country. In that dark cluster, you can see sort of the top performance whose MCAT is above a 30 and whose GPA is above a 3.4. In the 30 to 32 MCAT range, if you've got a really great GPA, you've got a better than 80% chance of getting into medical school. All it did for me was kind of reframe what these numbers look like, because here, and at many of the top 20 medical schools, the numbers are so skewed to the high end, we have no realization of what the rest of performance looks like and the accessibility of medical school admission. Okay. The predictive validity of the MCAT exam in relation to academic performance through medical school. So this is what you have always wanted to see, right? Depending on my MCAT score, what are my chances of completely blowing it in medical school? Blowing it, according to this paper, was they called it unimpeded progress, and they defined it as not being dismissed, not withdrawing for academic reasons, graduating within 5 years, so you give people a chance to some scholarly year, people do sometimes, or take a year off, and passing USMLE steps 1, 2, CK, and CS on the first attempt. So it's a pretty high bar. And you see on the bottom GPA, right? So if you drag your eye up from a 3.0 GPA, you'll see that your chance of finishing medical school with unimpeded progress is 80% if your GPA entering was a 3.0. 3.5, you go up to 90%, etc. Again, it just helps. I think it helps to reframe what these numbers actually mean in practice across the country. And this is the exact same article, but looking at the MCAT score. So there's your MCAT of 30. God forbid it's your MCAT of 30. There's your MCAT of 30, and if you track it up, you're 90% likely to finish medical school with this unimpeded progress definition with an MCAT of 30. So you're pretty likely to be successful in medical school, despite a range that many of the best medical schools think is totally unacceptable in their admissions process. So far, so good. Okay. So I promised a quick word about what's happening to the MCAT. This doesn't really do it justice. It was a process that took years. The last major review of the MCAT was in 1991. This is the 5th time it's been reviewed in a significant way since 1928 when it was established. And basically I described here what it used to test, what it tests now, which is obviously much broader, and a little bit of a description of how much more time the actual exam is going to be. And the motivations behind this change, the intentions are obviously all good. If you look at the difference between what was tested then and what will be tested in 2015, it includes the kinds of things that we all recognize are really important for success in medicine and in biomedical research. It doesn't take out a lot of the stuff that has already always been in there. And this is my comic relief. You guys know what this is? Tough Mudder. So this is my not so great maybe metaphor for chemistry and MCATs in terms of setting the bar high for getting into medical school. So I made the case before that it's important to have a rigorous process, but it's also important to have a rigorous process that is somehow aligned with what you're actually trying to produce at the end of the day. So my analogy is Tough Mudder is a really tough race, but it's not necessarily going to select out for a particular, unless you want to select out big burly men who like to get wet, muddy, and run through electrified wire, which is what they're doing. All right, no more comedy. That was my lame attempt. So a synopsis of the critique. Pre-med preparation has fallen far behind scientific discovery. Current information technology and education pedagogy makes memorization really ridiculous, a thing of the past. We question the clinical, scientific, social relevance of the way people are prepared for medical school. There's this whole history or culture of hazing, weeding people out, separating the wheat from the chaff. These are all quotes from articles in the past. It's pretty clear. I don't think anyone argues that it disadvantages minority and women students who want to become physicians. It certainly constrains the degree to which someone can pursue their intellectual interests in college. People like us are very reluctant to challenge themselves, maybe end up with a B or a C in an almost graduate level course in college for something they're really interested in, but it's going to jeopardize their GPA. There's a lot of discussion about whether it negatively impacts the ability to be a lifelong learner. If all you're trying to do is study to memorize to perform on exams, are you really learning how to learn while you're in college? And then that whole pre-med syndrome, I think, is folded into it. Okay, so I wanted to say a word about this because it ties into the question of diversity. I don't know, is anybody familiar with this book? No. It's called The Difference: How the Power of Diversity Creates Better Groups, Firms, Schools, and Societies. I bought this book because I was totally fascinated by the title. I found it almost impossible to read because this guy is professor of complex systems, political science and economics, and he directs the Center for the Study of Complex Systems. And I am not all about complex systems. So but the book is fascinating because the case that he makes, and he makes the case using high order mathematics, logic models, and empiric research. This is not like one of those Harvard Business Review books with lots of interesting anecdotes about why something is really important leadership skill. This is very, very hardcore data that makes his point that what he calls informational diversity, right? So I say the word diversity, diversity is in the title, and everyone in the room has just sort of different images of what that means. For him, informational diversity is reflective of a person's diverse educational experiences, life experiences, values, and goals. Right? So he's not saying that women are blank, or people of color are blank, or people who are gay and lesbian are blank. He's saying informational diversity, which to him, he makes the case in the book, comes with all of that baggage, because everything you bring to your university experience, your high school experience, the way you grew up, the environment you were raised in, contributes informational diversity. And he shows absolutely systematically a couple of things, and some of them are self-evident to us already. Teams of people are better than brilliant individuals. He's got case after case. Those teams are more productive, more creative, and better at problem solving. And diverse groups, right, this informational diversity, comprised of people with very different perspectives, are far better than those groups or teams of like-minded experts. And so he makes the strongest case that I've seen, to the extent that I could understand his math, which was very limited, that this issue of diversity is crucial. And so then the leap, and I admit that it's a leap, that I'm making, or I think that some of us are making, many of us are making, is that the constraints created by a pre-med curriculum in the MCAT really preclude us from attracting this kind of diversity to healthcare. And now I'm going to talk about what we, since the time of Nathan Case, have tried to do about it. Now, I'm not making the case that Nathan Case, who's sitting in the room, did this for exactly the same reasons. It was a very complex process that happened back then. I'm not going to do it justice here because I'm sort of diminishing all the complexity and nuance of it. But the diversity piece to me is the point to which it has evolved now, and I'll talk about that a little later. So humanities and medicine established in '89, a very limited number of schools, a small number of students per year, sort of as a pilot, kind of dip your toe in the water, but it wasn't really a pilot. The program was launched, but on a scale that it could be adjusted quickly over the course of time. And this is some of the descriptors of how the program was structured back then. By 2005, which is when I started in this role, a quarter of every class was entering, more or less a quarter of every class was entering from the HUMED pool. Anecdotally, based on what we were telling each other and what it felt like in the school, the students did seem to have a little bit of a harder time when they first started, and then for the most part really took off and were successful. But it was all anecdotal until he forced me, almost at gunpoint, to sit down with him and collect the data and write this paper, which we did. In 2010, we looked at 6 graduating classes, and it basically showed that with very little variation, people who came into the school through the HUMED program did as well as their peers. There's some unpublished data, and unpublished because the numbers really aren't big enough, where the dean's office has looked at people's outcomes, students, graduates, far past medical school and residency, and as faculty. I'm not going to present it because I'm not comfortable presenting something that really hasn't been looked at rigorously, but certainly we know with a great deal of confidence that within the course of medical school, these students are at the very least capable of performing as well as their peers, despite a very, very different experience getting here. And so it raised a couple of interesting questions once we did this paper, and I think Dr. Case and I had a little bit of a debate about it. It works, but we don't know why it works. Does it work because a liberal arts education is really what it takes to be a great doctor, or is at least as important as a science education? Does it work because we are starting a process early in sophomore year, and so we're selecting out, we're cherry picking the best students when no one's competing with us? Is it because they're smarter than their peers? Is it because they're more mature as a sophomore they can make this decision? It really wasn't entirely clear, and I think as we went through the process of thinking through it, different people came to different conclusions. The final conclusion that we came to, I don't know if it's right or not, is that a liberal arts education is great, it's critically important, but it seemed more likely that early assurance of acceptance to medical school, no MCAT pressure, no pre-med syndrome, and reasonably high standards. You know, you still have to maintain a decent GPA, but you don't have to worry about every class you take and maybe getting a B in it. The opportunity that provides for people to really explore their interests in college, learn how to learn, develop their minds, was the key to the success of the program. I can't prove that that was the case. We still don't entirely agree on it, but we've gotten over it, I think. Our personal relationship has survived, right, Dr. Case? More or less. More. So this is a little bit of a description of the conclusions that we came to that would be elements that make for a better pre-med preparation. Has to be academically rigorous, but doesn't have to be this grades-driven competition. The opportunity to do really high-level independent mentored scholarship, the flexibility to pursue your major, self-directed educational plans, you can read it all for yourselves. The science and the more clinically relevant coursework to prepare one for medical school and for a career in medicine. Okay. So then we took these conclusions and we built FlexMed, which at this point I think everyone has at least heard of, if not very familiar with. I'm not going to go into the process of what it took to do that. It was a painstaking process. It involved a lot of people, faculty, chairs of departments, institute directors, medical students, a lot of working groups, an external review of the process once we sort of had proposed what the structure would look like. Because it was going out on a limb. It was taking humanities and medicine and saying, you know what, this has been so successful, we're going to do two things. We're going to ramp it up in size. It's not going to be a quarter of the class. It's ultimately going to be half of the class, because that's how much faith we have in the success of the program and its ability to inject this informational diversity into the medical school experience that benefits everyone. And we're going to expand it so that it's not just the humanities anymore, it's every major. Because if pursuing your passion in college is good for, you know, French medieval poetry, it's also good for biomedical engineering. There's no reason necessarily to distinguish between the two. So we developed the program, we wrote a position paper, somehow magically got it published. And then we also, mostly with the help of Rob Fowler, where the heck is he? Went through the process of getting IRB approval to track the outcomes. Because if we were going to do it, this time we wanted to do it in a very rigorous way so that 5 or 10 years down the line, or maybe in 2-year increments, we could compare the groups and convince ourselves that this is really working, or convince ourselves that it doesn't work and needs tweaking, and maybe make a more, start a more national trend to expand the way people look at who needs to come to medical school. This is just the FlexMed requirements. I will say that we did a lot of outreach and marketing to try to launch this program because it was a little bit risky and we wanted to make sure that it was out there. The bulk of the outreach that we did was to organizations around the country. And, Gates Millennium is one of them, Ron Brown Scholars, Posse, Prep for Prep. These are all organizations that identify pretty early on in high school, sometimes in middle school, kids from disadvantaged or minority communities who really have academic potential. And these organizations take them on, provide them with mentorship, guidance every step of the way, very often very large scholarships in order to get them through high school, college, and then whatever it is they want to do after that. And we wanted those organizations, and really more than anyone else, to know that this concept of FlexMed was something that these kids needed to know about. Because information is half the battle. If you know that this is potentially an opportunity for you as a sophomore in college, you need to find out as a senior in high school. And part of the disadvantage of being from a community that doesn't have those kinds of resources is if neither of your parents is a doctor and nobody works as a researcher in an institution, you're just not going to know. You're just not going to have access to the information. So that was, I think, probably the biggest part of our outreach. We managed to get the position paper into the New England Journal of Medicine. Not everyone was happy with it. We got some angry phone calls. And then I wanted to run quickly through some of the outcomes that George Schreiner was kind enough to pull together of the first year of FlexMed recruitment. So the numbers are here. I think they're easier to see than the numbers on the other slide. About 735 applications, interviewed 150 plus, and we took 51 in this first cohort. We wanted to end up again with about a quarter of the class the first time around, but we went above a quarter of the class in terms of number because we know there'll be some attrition. People will change their minds, they'll end up not doing so well in school, whatever the case may be. Of the 51, a little more than 20% are students from minority backgrounds, and you can see the rest of the breakdown. A little bit more women than men. The SAT scores, the GPAs are all very impressive. I think Valerie's not here, but I think George ran the list as much as any of us did. We could have taken 100 of these kids. It was just that good. And a nice variety of undergraduate schools, so we knew that we'd gotten the word out there. This is a much longer list and probably harder to see, so it's not critically important, but I also wanted people to get a little bit of a sense of the range of undergraduate majors, minors, the grades and stuff I presented before sort of as the average. But it was fascinating to see the breakdown of how many still humanities and social sciences students were interested in this. And it's much smaller, but we think a growing number of people who are coming from non-traditional science backgrounds, physics, math, computer science, engineering, whom we also want to recruit pretty aggressively in anticipation of where medicine is headed, where healthcare and biomedical research is headed. I'm talking so fast. So this is just a glimpse, and again, thanks to Rob Fowler for putting it together, of the outline of what the research project is going to look like for FlexMed. These are just some of the things that we're going to track and compare among the two cohorts, the FlexMed and the non-FlexMed. You can see some of the domains there, demographics, scholastics, etc. And then on the bottom, some of the things that I think most of us feel are more interesting potentially is exploring whether there are actual attributes or personality characteristics that are different in terms of the people who select this early assurance path, whether it impacts at all the way in which they experience medical school and residency. Are they more burned out? Are they less burned out? Does it vary over the course of time? A medical student who's graduating this year, his name is Lauren Feld, did a similar project looking at burnout and depression and comparing HUMEDs to the more traditionally prepared students, and found some really interesting stuff. I'm not going to present now because I don't have her data, and it's her data, and I don't have the time. So this will be the research study. This is a quick word. oh my Lord, running out of time. So part of what grew out of this is an interest from a foundation called the Josiah Macy Foundation. Was that Michelle that walked out? Too bad, I was about to give her a shout out too. All right, too bad. So the Josiah Macy Foundation provides educational grants. We've done some really great work with them in the past. They approached us and they said, we really are interested in this idea, FlexMed, and your expansion of it. How do you plan to make this a nationwide trend? So the way in which we planned to at least start that process was to host here at Sinai on campus, which we did this past June, what we called the National Summit on Pre-Med Preparation. And the approach we took to it very, very briefly is, I guess in the spirit of interdisciplinary or interprofessional education, right, that happens in medical schools, we decided to reach out to 5 or 6 disciplines, all of which have a key role in the pre-med preparation process. So undergraduate science educators, pre-health advisors, medical school admissions deans, people who run pipeline programs, people who run post-bac programs, and people who have developed innovative pathways through college to medical school. We invited those 6 groups in. We had a couple of thought leaders come from the AAMC and invited also from Howard Hughes. And we put them through a 2-day process in which each group was required to create a presentation to educate the rest of us. So the whole group was about, you see about 35 or 40 people there. Each group created a presentation about their discipline. What are the challenges? What are their best practices? What's their vision for the future? It was totally fascinating to hear how each discipline grapples with this concept of pre-med preparation. And it was even more fascinating to hear that most of the themes were totally universal across the board, despite the fact that we rarely talk to each other. And then the second day was really more about working in same discipline and mixed discipline groups about developing innovations for sort of envisioning the future of medical education. We took the presentations, the discipline-specific ones, we put them together as a paper. It's a little bit unruly, as you can imagine, but we're this close to the final draft. I talked to the editor at Academic Medicine before submitting it sort of formally, because it's very different than what they usually take, and he's very interested in publishing it, but wants to kind of get a sense of it first as a preview. So it's very exciting, and this is a poster that we're going to present at the AAMC about the summit. And then the last thing that I want to say, and I'm not going to go into this because it would take too much time, but I do want to say that the idea of creating a path to medical school that is less constraining, right, allows for more flexibility, more diversity of experience, and all the other kinds of diversity that come with it, started us thinking about the other place we get a lot of applicants from, a growing number of applicants, which is people who maybe did some science in college, but maybe did none, weren't certain that they wanted to pursue medicine, went off and did something else, and then came to the realization, medicine is for me. And if they come to the realization at that point, they've got quite a bit of work to do. They typically have to stop working if they were working. A year or more often 2 years doing post-bac coursework to finish all their requirements, the MCAT, and then very often, unless they're in something called the linkage program, another year to just apply and then finally come to medical school. And so part of what we started to do was to explore opportunities to attract incredibly talented people who have the goods. They can work hard, they're smart, they're disciplined, they're mature, they're good team players, and provide opportunities for them to apply to medical school in the same way that our FlexMed students do. So we're doing this now with McKinsey, the consulting firm. We're probably going to start doing it next year with the Rhodes Trust, the Rhodes Scholars at Oxford. None of these initiatives are going to generate large numbers of applicants, and very, very few people will probably end up actually in the school. But from our perspective, even 1 or 2 people who come from these backgrounds will be fascinating to work with and will contribute a lot to the medical school environment. And we hope that it extends this template of thinking about applicants to medical school in a very, very different way, not just sort of the cookie cutter way. I think that's all I got. That is all I have. So